It's the month of Abraham Lincoln's birthday, and I'm coming at you a little bit late on this, but better late than never. A reflection on Lincoln, specifically the biblical themes in Lincoln's view of the Civil War toward the end of his life. We're going to take a look at one text today, the second inaugural address of President Lincoln on the Republican Professor podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. I also have a high school diploma. So let's get to it. What do you say? We're going to read Lincoln's second inaugural address. I'm sharing my screen. Feel free to call me Sharon. On March 4th, 1865, only 41 days before his assassination. This is on the National Park Service website, the Lincoln Memorial. This is the prefatory explanation of what we're about to read. 41 days before his assassination, obviously, President Lincoln didn't write this part, right? It's kind of like Moses didn't write the part in the last part of Deuteronomy where he died. President Lincoln took the oath of office for the second time. Lincoln's second inaugural address previewed his plans for healing a once divided nation. The speech is engraved on the north interior wall of the Lincoln Memorial. Have you been there? Have you been there? I've been there. Wonderful. Now, why does it say he was taking the oath of office March of 1865? Doesn't the president take the oath of office January 20th? Tell me in the comments if you know the answer to that. Are you puzzled by that? Do you notice these kind of things? All right, we're going to get going. Here's President Lincoln, March 4th, 1865, toward the end of the Civil War, and sadly, since he was assassinated by a Democrat, um, toward the end of his life. His mature reflections on the Civil War as President of the United States. Fellow countrymen, at this second appearing to take the oath of the presidential office, there is less occasion for an extended address than there was at the first. Happy birthday, President Lincoln. Clinton, geez. Then a statement somewhat in detail of a course to be pursued seemed fitting and proper. Now, at the expiration of 4 years, during which public declarations have been constantly called forth on every point and phase of the great contest, which still absorbs the attention and grosses the energies of the nation, little that is new could be presented. The progress of our arms, upon which all else cheaply depends, is well known to the public as well as to myself, and it is, I trust, reasonably satisfactory and encouraging to all. With high hope for the future, no prediction in regard to it is ventured. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, that was the beginning of the Civil War. Now, I want to pause here for a second. I want you to pay attention to this. Pay attention. Listen for the biblical themes. And, if you're biblically illiterate, you might not be able to see these themes, but that's okay. I have a PhD in public law and American politics, and I spent 6 years in seminary. Yeah, I know. 6 years studying the Bible in the original languages. Of course, I grew up reading the King James Version of the Bible. See the episode I did with Daniel Dreisbach, Rhodes Scholar. DPhil, Oxford, on reading the Bible with the founding fathers. That was back in 2022 on the Republican Professor podcast. Pay attention to these biblical themes here just after President's Day, marking the anniversary or the birthday of two of our greatest presidents, including Lincoln here. On the occasion corresponding to this, what's this? The Civil War, what we call the Civil War. 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves, he's being nice, by the way. Why? What do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean to say he's being nice? He really means the Democratic areas, which is the opposite political party from what he is. The Democrats were opposed to the Republicans. Not much has changed on that front. Welcome to American politics. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union, even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with, or even before, the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God. And each invokes his aid against the other. Okay, I want to stop right here. The topic today on the Republican Professor podcast is Abraham Lincoln, specifically biblical themes in Abraham Lincoln's view of the Civil War, his mature view on the Civil War. And he's already mentioned the Bible. The President of the United States is talking about the most important consequential event in American history besides maybe the Revolution, okay? And drafting the Constitution, pretty important, ratifying it, okay? Oh, sure. We can make arguments about what's more important, and those arguments would go directly to the question of who's the greater president, Lincoln or Washington, who's number one, who's number two. Um, but this has to be, I think, looking back, the most monumental occasion in American history. Um, and the president of the United States, while in the middle of this, well, toward the end of it, brings up the Bible. Now, it sounds kind of relativistic what he's saying. I mean, at least in terms of belief, not in terms of truth, as you'll see. Lincoln is not a relativist on truth. He's not an alethic relativist. Aletheia in Greek means truth. See the episode on the Republican professor a few months ago in the fall of 2024, the correspondence theory of truth. He accepts that theory of truth, I'm sure. I mean, if you were to ask him, not that he would know the name of that theory, but that truth is what is the case, what corresponds to reality. He's not a relativist. He wouldn't say that truth is the same thing as belief. And beliefs are relative to people. I have my beliefs, you have yours, but it doesn't follow that I have my truth and you have yours, because truth and belief are not the same thing. So he's not a relativist. He's not saying that the Bible is a relativist document either. He's just noting that both seem to invoke the Bible in various ways. And then he takes a position which is not surprising. He takes the Republican view of the Bible, which I think is the correct view. And he said he gets this in there, this dig. It may seem strange that men should dare ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. What do you notice about that sentence there? Do, and those of you who don't know the Bible, that's okay. Well, I'll fill in some details here for you, in case you're wondering. It may seem strange that any men should dare ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. That's very interesting. Well, let me just offer this for you if you would like. Notice he says a just God's assistance. Um, he believes that the God of the Bible is just. And the Democrats have the wrong view. They're just wrong about what the Bible teaches on this. Philosophically, is there any reason to think that God is just? Let me give you one piece to think about. The ontological argument. Um, I don't want to do an episode just on the ontological argument right now because we're talking about President uh, Lincoln, and I don't think we should do too much at one time here. But what I think is very valuable about the ontological argument, which is the claim basically that God exists, and the evidence that God exists is the very idea of God. It prompts the question, though, how do you know what the idea of God is? I once heard somebody assert that God is the geese, and this was a clergy that said this, and I thought, well, I don't think that fits with the idea of God, because the idea of God is the greatest conceivable being, greater than which can be conceived. And geese don't fit that. Geese are finite creatures. They're contingent. Um, they depend on the created order rather than uh, bring it into existence. Um, yeah, so there's some missing parts there that are just purely theoretical. Um, Atheists believe that geese exist, but atheists don't believe God exists. If you were to ask an atheist whether the greatest conceivable being exists, they would say no. Okay. So that helps explain the concept of God. They're saying no to that. We got to have the same definition here. I'm saying yes, they're saying no. I'm a theist, they're an atheist. I think we have the concept right. Because we're going to say we're both of us going to say yes to geese existing. We don't disagree about that. We disagree about whether the greatest conceivable being exists. That is to say, we disagree with whether God exists. Now, if you have the greatest conceivable being, then justice is a part of that. It's a necessary part of that. And I would venture to guess that if we were to discuss this with Abraham Lincoln, he would grant that and maybe even say it. Um, he's a very thoughtful man. He was self-educated on the King James Version of the Bible, Euclid's logic and geometry, Shakespeare, and Blackstone's commentaries on the common law of England. He was a self-educated lawyer. Well, he learned by trade, which is to say that's how most attorneys back then were trained was they were mentored. Now here's as far as I can see, is the first quotation from the Bible, let us judge not that we be not judged. Why does he say that? That's from the Sermon on the Mount. We referenced that in the last episode on Scalia's dissent in Morrison versus Olson. Remember? The wolves in sheep's clothing. This wolf comes as a wolf. That's directly from Matthew chapter 7, verse 15. Well, judge not that you may judge. That's from Matthew as well. And I'm just going to put that there. I think this is a political use of the Bible there because part of Lincoln's crazy job at this point, if you can believe it, is to win the Civil War. And remember, if he wins, we're all Americans again, and we have to somehow live with each other. And that's a political challenge, not a military challenge. Ideally, it became a military challenge because of the terrorism of the Klan the Democrats started after the Civil War, after Lincoln was murdered by Democrats. But I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to set the stage for peace. Not at any cost. I mean, he's not saying, neither one of us is wrong, but I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to use the Bible and remind us of the peacemaking texts in the Bible. Okay. Now let's keep going here. Um, do I want to do this now? I think I will do this now. I think I need to say a little bit more about this text right here. It may seem strange that any men should dare ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. What, is there any biblical reason why President Lincoln would say something like that? Can you think of anything? I'm going to show you some scriptures that may have been in Lincoln's mind that strike me as anti slavery scriptures, if there ever were any. We do need to qualify this a little bit in terms of indentured servitude versus the kind of slavery that existed in America, which was based on kidnapping. So let's start with a verse from Paul. I'm going to give you a couple of verses from St. Paul. First is 1 Timothy 5:18. Scripture says, "Do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain." That is a quotation from Deuteronomy 25:4. Do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. What does that mean? Well, it means that while the ox is doing work, he needs to eat. He needs to get something for what he's doing. And that's the idea there that St. Paul is alluding to, kind of like you're stealing from the ox. If you prevent the ox from benefiting from the work that he's doing. Right after that, St. Paul says in 1 Timothy 5:18, the worker deserves his wages. This is a rare moment where a, the Gospels are being quoted. And if you don't know anything about New Testament history or a theory of composition, um, this is quoting the Gospels, and allegedly this was written before the Gospels, which might strike you as a little odd. But it's evidence of an oral tradition or perhaps a written tradition that existed quite early about what Jesus was saying. And of course, he doesn't say this, but Luke 10:7 has that exact phrase where the laborer is worthy of his wages. And it's stated not, I mean, take a look at the role that this plays. It's not stated as a new idea that needs to be defended. Rather, it's just casually mentioned like we all believe this, right? I mean, this is this is what we think of when we think of work. Romans 4, verse 4. Now, this is another one of those things that just seems like some people would treat this as a throwaway line. It's not a throwaway line. It's not something that he thought was controversial at all. This is the King James. Now, to him that worketh is the reward not reckoned of grace, but of debt. You think, what the heck does that mean? Now, to him that worketh is the reward not reckoned of grace, but of debt. I'm going to pull it up in the New King James. I like the New King James. I think it's delightful. I think it's also important to read it in the King James Version because of the literary importance of it in English history. Romans 4, verse 4. Now to him who works, the wages are not counted as grace, but as debt. In other words, you owe wages to the person that works. Okay, let's try it in the New American Standard. What do you say? I like the New American Standard too. New American Standard says, now to the one who works, his wage is not credited as a favor, but as what is due. In other words, I'm working, it's you don't pay me as a favor, right? The employer doesn't say, "Hey, you know what? I'm going to do you a favor. I'm going to pay you for the work you did." That's not our theory here. And remember, this is really old. This is like 2,000 years ago. And it's probably a lot older than that. It probably goes back to do not steal. The whole idea. Now, if you're thinking
No, John Locke came up with that. John Locke said that, you own your own labor and all that stuff.
Well, but I'm giving you evidence that maybe John Locke got that from somebody else. Maybe he was getting it from the Bible or some tradition that was independent or at least consistent with, maybe some in some way dependent on the Bible, but a very old tradition and makes sense. It makes perfect sense. Let's take a look at Exodus 21. I want to show you. Now, the Ten Commandments are in Exodus 20. The very next chapter, Exodus 21, verse 16. Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is in the kidnapper's possession. This is illegal. You cannot kidnap somebody. American slavery was dependent on the crime of kidnapping, which is a death penalty crime in the biblical tradition. There's another episode I could do here just on Joseph's story between 1841 and 1842. In 1841 was a famous Amistad case that was about slavery, and Joseph's story on the Supreme Court sided with the slaves. Now remember, this is during slavery, 1841. Why did he side with the slaves? That's painful to talk about because it's a painful reality of slavery as it existed in the United States and in the so-called New World. But if you look at that case carefully, and I think we maybe should do that in the Republican Professor podcast, because it is related to the Republican Party. um, the Amistad case really turned on the issue of kidnapping. And there was evidence that these people had been kidnapped. And that's a capital offense in the biblical tradition and in the law of admiralty as it existed back then. The crime of kidnapping was the underlying crime in the fraud that had occurred that the court uncovered. The fraud was what made the slaves go free in that case. So there were underlying crimes of kidnapping and conspiracy and fraud. Now you might think, well, why don't you just make slavery a crime? Well, Republicans were trying to do that later on. That's why the Republican Party started. But there's an earlier tradition of you can't kidnap, you can't commit fraud, you can't perjure yourself, you can't falsify documents, you can't conspire with other people to do those other crimes. And that's a big deal. And they took that more seriously than they did slavery at that time. The Republicans sought to change that to create uh, 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 an, an awareness and a sympathy for our old tradition of a worker is worthy of his wages. Uh, to the one who works, his wages are credited not as a favor, but as his due. And these old traditions, you know what I mean? You know what I mean, Vern? And sometimes the most obvious thing is really obvious, and so you go right over it and you forget about it. Um, a little, so I mean, Let me show you one more biblical verse and then we'll move on. I'm going to read to you from quite possibly the earliest writing in the New Testament. I think it's the only Christian writing in existence. I mean, sorry, the earliest Christian writing in existence that references a Christian meeting and uses the word synagogue. That's how early this is. It's James and it's chapter 5. Um, Come now, you rich. I'm in the New King James Version. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. Okay. You know what? Right after this happened, right after James said this, some people came around to me and said, James, we're concerned about you. You seem to have a lot of anxiety. James, we're just concerned about you. I think James probably would have brushed them off and said, excuse me, maybe you didn't hear what I just said. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasure in the last days. Now, how did they get this gold? Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud.
I thought they were just volunteers.
Cry out. The wages cry out to God. They will eat your flesh like fire. And the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts, is the Hebrew. You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. You have fattened your hearts as in the day of slaughter. You've condemned and you have murdered the just. Guys, this is 2,000 years old. Okay. This is not John Locke. John Locke is getting his stuff from here. And this is older even because this is a Jewish tradition. And it goes back to do not kidnap. Don't do it. Lincoln's second inaugural. So it may seem strange to quote Lincoln, going back, that any men should dare ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. This is the tradition that he has behind him. This is the Republican understanding of the Bible on these matters. He says the prayers of both could not be answered, the North and the South, on this issue of slavery. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come. But woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. Does that sound like he's quoting something? I mean, it sounds Elizabethan. The English has changed to Elizabethan English. And in case you don't know, this is 1860 something. This is 1865. Queen Elizabeth lived 300 years before that. Okay. 250, 300 years is when they talk like this. Okay. Um, he's quoting the Bible. He's not telling you he's quoting the Bible because people know what he's quoting. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses, which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both the North and the South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him, namely justice, being the greatest conceivable being, going back to St. Anselm and prior to that, even in the biblical tradition? What is he quoting here? What is this woe unto the world because of offenses? What is he quoting there? He's quoting Matthew 18. Matthew 18. Let's take a look at Matthew 18. And I think that this is going to be very interesting for you because he's quoting it and he's not really explaining why he's quoting it. I think what he's doing there is he's bringing it to mind to bring the context to mind. Because remember, these guys were biblically literate. I mean, they had read the Bible before, not just before, but a lot. And um, he's quoting Matthew 18:7 here. I meant to do it in the King James so that you could see the King James version here. Let me pull up the King James. Matthew 18:7. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come. But woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. Let's go back to Lincoln's inaugural address. Now, this is a central thing that he's referencing right smack in the middle of his second inaugural address while he's talking about the Civil War and slavery. And what in the world does he have in mind here? Well, it's an offense. It's an offense. And what about offenses in Matthew? Well, let's take a look at the context before and after. The context is little children are coming up to him and in Matthew 19, parents are bringing their children. They want Jesus to pray for them. The disciples say, no, get out of here. And Jesus says, no, do not hinder the little children. Come to me. There's this classic verse, whoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Wow. Wow. Hard to wrap your mind around that. So he's saying, and whoso shall receive one of these little children in my name shall receive me. Whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck and that he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Does that sound like a loving Jesus to you? He's saying, if you cause these little kids to sin, you get the death penalty, buddy. It would be better for you to be drowned in the depths of the sea. That's how serious this is. Look at verse 8. Wherefore, if thy hand or thy foot offend thee, cut them off, cast them from thee. It is better for thee to enter life halt or maimed, rather than having two hands or 2 feet to be cast into everlasting fire. That's the context here. Verse 9, if thine eye offend thee, pluck it out, cast it from thee. It is better for thee to enter into life with one eye rather than having two eyes and to be cast into hellfire. What he's saying, Lincoln is clearly saying, that that American slavery is sin. We're teaching children that it's okay. That should have the death penalty. That's what he's saying as the Republican president in his second inaugural, and he's using the Bible to do it. That's the Republican answer. Now, the word political hack gets thrown around. I don't think we can say that Lincoln's being a political hack here, whatever that means, if I even understand the term. He says, if we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those sins, and that he wills to remove this. Now, what is this language of removing? It comes right out of the Matthew passage. We just saw it. Plucking, we're talking about removing what causes sin. And it's going to be painful, but we got to remove it because of the offense that it brings to children. I mean, I love the King James, but I think I want to read this in the New American Standard just to uh, spruce it up here for the contemporary ear, and this is a good translation. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, I'm quoting Matthew 18:4. He's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and be drowned in the depth of the sea. Here's the one that Lincoln quotes. Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks, for it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come. But woe to that man through whom the stumbling block comes. The Democrats. And he's being nice. He's not saying the Democrats, but that's really what he's saying. Verse 8, if your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be cast into the eternal fire. If your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life with one eye than to have 2 eyes and be cast into the fiery hell. So, my he says, if we shall suppose, this is Lincoln, if we shall suppose that American slavery predicated on kidnapping, death penalty, is one of those offenses by which in the providence of God he must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both the North and the South, this is interesting, this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in the living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it should continue till all the while, all the wealth piled up by the bondsman. Now, what does that sound like? That sounds like James. That sounds like that James passage. You have heaped up treasure in the last days. The labor, the wages of the labor which you kept back by fraud, cry out. It sounds very familiar. Let's go back to Lincoln. 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As it was said 3,000 years ago, so it still must be said. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. And there he's quoting the Psalms. quoting the Old Testament. With malice toward none and charity for all. Oh my gosh. Now, wow. How do you get that? How do you get malice toward none and charity for all? Guys, this is Christian nationalism, I hate to say. And you don't like to hear it, but that's what he's doing here. He's defending the nation, specifically in Christian terms. This is a Christian thing to say. And you know what? It led to the Klan, unfortunately. Not in a way you think, though, not because Christianity supports it. It's because he was trying to move on. Because, I mean, how do you, if both the North and the South are guilty here, and we're both getting what is we really deserve for this sin of slavery, well, how the hell do you move forward? Christianity offers the answer: forgiveness. I know you don't want to hear it, but that's Christian national. That's the Christian answer. And that's exactly what he planned to do before he was murdered. That's what, to some extent, General Grant did at Appomattox when he paroled all those guys, said, take your horses. I mean, they were war criminals. With malice toward none and charity for all, with the firmness and the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in to bind up the nation's wounds. Now, there's a biblical allusion there too from Isaiah 61. You guys know this stuff, right? Maybe you don't. I don't know. Isaiah 61 is quoted in Luke 4. Jesus goes into the synagogue and reads from the scroll of Isaiah. It was a messianic reference to binding up, healing the brokenhearted, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan. Widow, by the way, is defined as a woman who is married to a man who has died, by the way. In other words, a widow is someone whose spouse died and she's a woman, and it means woman who whose husband died. Think about all those orphans and widows. To do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. My gosh. Wow. Wow, 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 wow. There's a lot there. You want to hear a story? At Pepperdine University in Malibu, where I was a faculty member, I was a plaintiff in a class action. Now, I didn't sue them. I didn't sue them, and it's settled now. And the terms of the settlement are made. But they were sued for unfair labor practices, and I got a portion of the settlement. And again, it wasn't my idea to do that, but uh, well, it was over 10 years ago that I began making reference to what I noticed were they weren't paying me for the work I was doing. And it went about 2 years, and I finally just quoted scripture. I quoted that James passage to my dean, and my dean's name was, well, I'm not going to say the name of him, but I finally just quoted James. I quoted this passage because what Pepperdine had done was collect tuition from my students and not pay me for a class I taught. They eventually paid me without any kind of legal issue. They paid me just days after I sent this email quoting James. I said the wages of the laborer who mowed your field, which you kept back by fraud, cry out to God. And they paid me. They finally paid me 2 years late. I was also a plaintiff in a class action against Loyola Marymount University. Again, it was not my idea. It's a matter of public record. Um, I, in fact, the money from that funded this podcast when I first started. That was the seed money for the Republican Professor podcast. I will say that the amount that I got from Loyola was a lot more than I got from from Pepperdine, um, comparatively, compared to the work I did. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that Pepperdine was responsive to the biblical imperative that I quoted in an email as evidence that you should pay laborers for what they do. Like Paul said, St. Paul said in the Romans 4:4, and it does sound like it just feels like a throwaway line, but it's something that was just obvious. Now to the one who works, his wage is credited not as a favor, but what is due. And Pepperdine was saying, no, no, this was, you did this as a favor to us. And I said, no, no, I was working. I was teaching students. That's not, my wages are not credited as a favor, but what is due? Well, they eventually acknowledged it and paid me. And that's why I got less of a settlement from Loyola because Loyola, ironically, more Democrat. I don't know if that's ironic, but it's just true that they were far more callous about uh, putting work on adjunct professors and then not paying them for it. And the callousness of it was really sad to me. And there's settlement wording in there, and I don't know what they admitted or whatever. All I know is I got a check, and this is what happened as far as my experience of it goes. And so I say that because, first of all, it's true, and it's a matter of public record, and it's what funded this podcast initially, and it's sad. It's sad that people even today need that think of themselves as enlightened. I mean, I can't tell you how many times people at Loyola Marymount tried to get me to join a union to, and I know that there's this other argument. We talked about it on this podcast with Eric Greenberg, dear friend of mine, who tried to get me to join a union. Just look back on adjunct issues from 2022 with Eric Greenberg. Fantastic episode. And Eric has a lot of great points, and I love him to death. I'm not sure I ever agreed about the union thing, but his point was, yeah, we do need to be paid better, and we need to have a clearer eye on this. And the answer is unions. And I never, I so there are Democrats that are on this, and they think the unions are the answer. And I have other issues with unions. The way that all came about, but uh, I quoted the Bible to Pepperdine and they were responsive to that. And so I still did get a settlement because turned out they didn't pay me enough for what I was doing. But it was a lot less than Loyola, uh, fairly compared to what the work I was doing. It was a lot less, both in absolute terms and in relative terms. So Lincoln's, that's just a tidbit there. I have another story I want to share with you about Claremont. where I did my doctoral work in public law and American politics. I took this course uh, on religion and politics in America. It was a great course taught by a Columbia professor, the Gouverneur Morris Professor of History, uh, named um, Richard Bushman. Hold on a sec. I was going to share with you the story from Claremont. I had Richard Bushman, wonderful professor, Department of History, Columbia University. There, I had him for a course called Religion, Politics, and Society. He was the Gouverneur Morris Professor, Emeritus Professor of History at Columbia in the city of New York. Um, and I thought I had a nice time in his class. It was a survey course, taught kind of led by a TA. Um, we came across the issue of slavery and the Bible, and went through the readings that particular week. We The TA, I thought, closed down the discussion and said something like, um, I think I'm being pretty fair. I think he said, uh, we can all agree that the Bible supports slavery, right? And we were reading Lincoln's second inaugural that week. And it was like there's old Bushman there just kind of monitoring this professor, Ivy League professor of history, didn't say anything, you know. And so I had hardly said anything all semester, and I finally just said, "Hey, guys, no, we're not looking at this very carefully. We're not looking at Lincoln's second inaugural very carefully. We're not looking at the biblical tradition as carefully as really we ought to." And hence we're misunderstanding the role of religion in American politics here in the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln. Um, so I said, first of all, we got to take a look at his explicit quotations of, for example, Matthew's gospel. Woe unto the world. I mean, no one had even mentioned he was quoting the Bible here. I had been born and raised on the King James. So my ears pricked up when I heard that because I can hear King James. I can pick that sucker out of the crowd because I was forced to memorize it as a kid, much like people back then during Lincoln's time had been forced to memorize it. They were tortured as children. And so we don't do that to our kids anymore. And the kids have lost a lot. We've lost our ability to connect with the past when we read and when we hear these important phrases and signals. There's a lot that a phrase like this signals that would have been immediately apparent to the original hearers of Lincoln's second inaugural address and would have been probably quite upsetting to a lot of them. I mean, he was murdered just weeks after this. So, all that to say is, even, and I was in this class with a bunch of PhD students in religion, and I was on the politics side, in the public law, American politics side, taking a course over in the religion department. That's where this guy, Bushman, had been visiting from. He had been visiting uh, from New York and was visiting the School of Religion there at Claremont, teaching religion and politics uh, in America that semester that we were there. And so I just want to mention to you that even in the best case, even when you have people dedicating their lives to this, they can get lazy. Maybe they don't like Republicans, maybe they don't like the Bible, and so they could maybe sometimes be unfair um, in their expertise. So um, all this is relevant as we think about Lincoln's birthday and we think about the impact that he had on our nation. We I hope that we take some time to pause in our day, in our week, in our month, and remember uh, what he really believed about slavery and the Bible and how that impacted the United States of America and what we can learn from it even now as Republicans and as citizens. And I say Republicans not be, if you're, in the party, I'm not saying that. I mean, are you committed to a Republican form of government? The Republican form of government is guaranteed by the US Constitution. Remember that in the United States Constitution. And I think it's important for us to think about what the word Republican means. Look at the episode I did just a few weeks ago, A Gay Republican. We talk about the definition of the Republican here. Here's Article 4, Section 4. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion. We're still dealing with this, guys. We're still dealing with this. These issues of the borders and whether the people can reliably elect those who would be in charge of the government. You know, let's take a look at Funk and Wagnall's definition of the word Republican. Of, like, suitable for a republic. What's a republic? Noun, a state in which the sovereignty resides in the people and the legislative and administrative powers are lodged in officers elected by them. That's still a live issue right now. Are the administrative powers lodged in officers elected by the people or not? Yes or no? That's what Scalia's dissent in Morrison versus Olson is about. Are the legislative powers lodged in officers elected by them, the people? That's what Chevron deference is all about. That's what we're going through. And we're supposed to have a Republican form of government. Thanks for joining me on the Republican Professor podcast. I've enjoyed this time. We'll see you next time.